This is Megan Basham of the Daily Wire, inviting you to join me for the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case Conference, Friday, June 12th and Saturday, June 13th at Concordia University, Chicago. I'll be speaking and signing copies of my book, Shepherds for Sale. And joining me at this annual conference for Christian laity are Molly Hemingway of The Federalist, Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch, and Aaron Hawley of Alliance Defending Freedom. Learn more at issuesetc.org, issuesetc.org.
There are several headlines on this particular story from the Baptist Press. Incoming ERLC president affirms government's duty to protect the right to worship. And from the Associated Press, and probably the story that's going to be getting the most attention here, there is the headline: after Minnesota church protests, states are toughening penalties for disrupting services. 4 states so far trying to pass laws to strengthen protections for worshipers and the possibility of encroaching protesters. Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Joining us to talk about this, Terry Mattingly. He's Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades, he led the GetReligion.org website. He joins us from Scotland. Terry, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
What role does the press play in these debates about protests in churches and abortion facilities?
Well, a lot of it just simply has to do on what they're willing to report and what they're not willing to report. So before we get into the details, I have an image that I think will help our listeners understand where I'm coming from on this. Years ago, I was in Washington, D.C. at a seminar on how to handle religion in public schools. And almost all of the controversies, of course, centered on the activities of conservative Catholics, conservative Christians, evangelicals, etc., and conservative or even Orthodox Jews. So they had discussed all these cases. And finally, one of the presenters in this off-the-record event was asked this by a head-on question by a public school leader who said, I'm having trouble with these evangelicals and these Catholics. What am I supposed to do when they come in and tell me that they want their child treated differently on tricky subjects related to religion, sex, etc., compared to other kids at the school? And the lawyer who was doing the briefing said, here's what you need to do. When those evangelicals walk in and sit across your desk, you need to look at them and do everything you possibly can to pretend that they're Muslims. And then hear their concerns about the protection of their religion and their religious liberty and their rights as parents. Try to hear their concerns exactly the way you would hear Muslims when these conservative Christians come at you. Pretend they're Muslims and treat them exactly the same as if they were Muslims. Now, what does this have to do with our current case? I think we need to say to reporters, when you're faced with the issue of protests taking place inside a religious sanctuary, the first thing you have to ask is, would I cover this story different if a bunch of right-wing religious believers invaded a mosque and began protesting? Would I cover the story the same way? Would I treat it the same way? Would I believe it's a page 1 story? Would I believe it's something that I need to do? So you have that. Then in terms of the actual existing U.S. laws from 1994, with Bill Clinton signing a bill that said you cannot threaten or injure, interrupt worship and abortion clinics. So you should then ask reporters, would you cover the story differently if protesters had invaded an abortion clinic and attempted to disrupt what was going on. Or even, let's take the issue outside the doors. You have protesters outside beating drums or doing whatever outside a church. Would you treat that the same outside as if it was a mosque? Would you treat it in coverage the same way you would if it was outside an abortion clinic? So that's the press angle to this. And what I believe we're seeing is that discussions of state laws to make clear or strengthen the 1994 law in the Bill Clinton era, I think what we're seeing with the press here is they're just having trouble saying that it's as important to defend religious liberty, that half of the First Amendment, as it is to defend the press liberty of journalists or the First Amendment liberties, the professional liberties of people working in abortion clinics. I don't think the press has the ability right now to think that going inside a church and saying things, doing things, chanting things that are scaring people in the pews, scaring children, I don't think they see that the same as if you went in and did exactly the same thing and scared people and scared children in a mosque. And I don't think they have the ability to see it for whatever reasons, journalistic or philosophical or worldview, whatever. And they certainly don't see it the same as protesters getting inside an abortion clinic and starting to chant things and yell at people and threaten people. They don't see these things as equal. And to some degree, this is shaping how these bills are being debated. And by the way, I'm not saying there are not legitimate First Amendment issues here. You and I had a conversation back at the time of the protests in the Baptist church in Minnesota with the anti-ICE protesters and Don Lemon, et cetera, et cetera. We had a discussion about the fact that I have questions in the internet age of who is a journalist and who is not. Did Don Lemon have a right as a press person to be there? Well, he wasn't working for CNN. He was working for his own private publication, which would still have First Amendment rights. Does he have the right as an activist who is also a journalist to go inside a church and he would say, do his job? Whereas the people on the other side of the microphone said he was intimidating them, he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he wouldn't leave. That, I said at the time, would be, that's a very important court case. We're going to have to hear how that goes down. But my big rambling answer here was to say the press is having trouble separating their convictions about conservative churches being hit by protests from some of these other issues that I've mentioned. For that matter, I would ask the question, if the Ku Klux Klan invaded the Baptist church in Atlanta, formerly led by Martin Luther King Jr., during a service and interrupted it, would police arrest them and take them out? And would they be charged with a violation of the 1994 Act? Passed in the Clinton era, would they be charged? So there's a fourth layer to this discussion. But I hope what listeners are hearing me say is that the law, however awkward it is and how much it may, in some ways, even in my own opinion, threaten key parts of the Amendment, are asking questions here. Different groups of people on whether they're equally protected under a law that says you may not interfere, interrupt, threaten people inside a religious sanctuary or an abortion clinic. That's the law. So now we're discussing making it clearer at the state level. And I think the press is struggling with these worldview issues.
So what did you make of the Associated Press story that is probably going to be the one that will key any other major stories?
Yeah, exactly right. This is the one that you're going to see all over America. And the several things in it, first of all, in their discussion of the ICE protest in Minneapolis, they accepted the fact that the two journalists who said they were journalists were, in fact, journalists. And without that, their discussion of the press rights of journalists under these laws, I think, like I said, that's an important question. I think it's a valid question, but you've got to admit that this is going to end up going to court on whether or not Don Lemon was acting as a journalist or was he acting as a member of the protest unit that went in. And I think one member of the activist group said they were a journalist because they were writing for their website or they were covering it for their own organization, et cetera. So that's another level of complexity in this. So the AP, instead of saying people who were claiming to be journalists at the time, or even saying Don Lemon, who used to work for CNN, but was acting on his own as a reporter that day, I think they could have added one more sentence that made that more clear. And second, I think they should have mentioned the 1994 Act much higher in the story. And all through the story, when they talked about Democrats and Republicans who were worried about these state-level acts or whether they were worried about their impact on journalists or free speech rights of protesters, et cetera, I think they could have worded that in a way to say, are these legislatures in the state levels, are they opposed to the 1994 Act? And at some point, it could have even said these state laws can be seen as an attempt to clarify what was passed by the U.S. Congress and signed by Bill Clinton in 1994. I think AP really needed to move the 1994 Act higher in the story and point out the degree to which that law is basically the heart of what's going on in these state pieces of legislation as well. So those are the two things I would point out in that at all as a, kind of a starting point. Let's see if there was anything else. I also think the story does a good job of pointing out that it's a different issue what happens outside of a church or inside of a church. Yet the irony there is we don't seem to have the same problem with safety zones around abortion clinics. What would happen if someone actually passed in one of these state laws the whole concept of a safety buffer zone around a church to where you couldn't even go inside the buffer zone of the church, synagogue, mosque, etc., and even just do something peaceful like stand holding a sign or hand out pamphlets. In England, of course, we have the famous case where this woman keeps getting arrested, and all she's doing is standing on a public sidewalk across the street from an abortion facility. And she's not even saying anything. She's praying inside her head. She's literally praying thought crimes. And the police, when they arrest her, she said, I haven't said anything. I haven't done anything. I'm not wearing anything. I don't even have, my rosary is in my pocket. They can't even see that I'm praying the rosary. And the police have said, it's on video, but we know what you're thinking. We know why you're here. Okay, can you imagine trying to enforce that in the United States without some clarity on these issues? We obviously don't have the same level of attacks on pro-life demonstrators, but the buffer zone concept is an even stronger point that if you're going to mention buffer zones with abortion clinics, I just hesitate to imagine what would happen in press coverage if one of these state laws proposed a buffer zone similar to abortion facilities. Frankly, I would question that. And I hope listeners hear me making that clear. But the point is, how would the press cover that? And frankly, I don't think they would see these things as parallel. Simply stated, in the 1994 law, have courts treated churches with the same strictness on these issues that they have applied to abortion clinics? I'd be interested in a separate story that simply asked that question and dug into it a bit.
Terry Mattingly is our guest. We're talking about media coverage of states passing laws, making it a crime to disrupt worship services. These 4 state laws are likely to be challenged in the courts. How should that be covered?
Where Christianity meets culture, you're listening to Issues, Etc.
The church's music from the 2nd century.
Shepherd of tender youth, guiding in love and truth.
The 6th century. The 12th century. The 16th century. The 21st century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Have you ever wanted to enter a program that teaches right habits and intellectual rigor as you apprehend the beautiful, the good, and the holy, all the while learning classical languages and reading classical texts? Do you want to be a classical scholar? I'm Dr. Charles Schultz, the new leader of the Classical Lutheran Education program at Concordia, Chicago. Learn more about this program at CUC by visiting cuchicago.edu, cuchicago.edu.
If you're in a small parish, you know how difficult it can be to find an organist when your musician is sick, has a family emergency, or simply wants a week off to visit the grandkids. Church Music Solutions can help. Our substitute organist service allows you to select your hymns and liturgy to be sent to an iPad that plays your church's organ. The best way to learn more is to log on to churchmusicsolutions.com and request a free demo kit. There are no obligations and there's no sales pitch. Keep singing with Church Music Solutions.
The Lutheran Church of Missouri Synod values all human life from conception to natural death. LCMS Life Ministry speaks up for life, cares for people in body and soul, and teaches about the sanctity of human life. Learn more at lcms.org/life, lcms.org/life. We're talking with Terry Mattingly about media coverage of states passing laws making it a crime to disrupt worship services. In about 20 minutes, we'll discuss the comfort of Lutheran theology with Pastor Matt Harrison, president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Terry, these laws, the 4 that are mentioned in the press and any that will follow, will likely be challenged in the courts. How should that be covered?
Well, I think, first of all, I think some of these bills should be challenged in courts to see if they're parallel to the 1994 Act. And I think it would be very interesting for someone to do a story on how protests inside churches have, in fact, been treated by courts. Do courts have trouble? State courts, in particular, let's say blue zip code courts, do they have trouble applying the 1994 Act the same way to a church or a religious sanctuary that they do to an abortion clinic? So there's another valid story. At the same time, this isn't the same law, but when you look at this from the viewpoint of the press, if right-wingers or anybody, anonymous people, burned down a mosque or a synagogue, would that receive more coverage than the serious uptick we've seen in the United States and even worse in Canada of the burning of churches? In the eyes of journalists, is it worse to burn a liberal church than a conservative church? Is it worse to burn a synagogue or a conservative church? Is it worse to burn a liberal synagogue than a conservative synagogue? Is it worse to burn an abortion clinic than to burn a church of any kind? So I'm raising questions here about how the press has viewed a concept that's at the heart of this legal debate. And I think it could potentially cripple the coverage. And by the way, I have a case study from the past that is directly related to this, and I think our listeners would remember it. You remember, of course, the 2019 story that got, several million headlines about the Covington Catholic High School boys at March for Life and their confrontation with the Native American activist Nathan Phillips. I think everybody would remember that. You think that's a fair guess?
Sure.
Okay. So I wrote a big piece for Get Religion about the fact that when that incident received all kinds of coverage, after that, Nathan Phillips himself went with a bunch of people with drums, chants, signs, etc., and they tried to interrupt a mass inside the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., a pro-life mass that was going on. And the coverage of it was non-existent, except in conservative Catholic. And what's interesting about that, this gets us back to the worldview issue with journalists. Are all eyewitnesses considered equal? In other words, if you had an eyewitness of, once again, an attempt to get through the doors by trickery or open invasion, pounding on the doors of a sanctuary of another tradition, and you're playing drums and you're chanting and you're doing speeches, lots of people saw what happened and gave their testimonies. None of it ended up in mainstream press. The Catholic News Agency, they kept following up, and it turned out there was security camera video that showed the demonstrations outside the church and seemed to show people trying to get inside the church, or at least pounding on the doors, chanting and playing drums while there was a mass going on inside. And that would seem to me to be a parallel case to the laws we're discussing right now. And the press gave that event, I don't think anyone denies that it happened. A lot of people said, well, they didn't actually crash the mass. Well, the question is not whether they achieved that or whether they attempted it in this case. And they say, well, they had every right to stand outside and play their drums, and Nathan Phillips had every right to give his speech, et cetera, et cetera. Well, frankly, I would think as far as a peaceful speech outside that doesn't interrupt what's going on inside the church, I would tend to agree with that. But pounding on the doors and playing drums outside of a mass, I once again wonder how would the press have covered that if that was right-wing Catholic kids interrupting a Native American rite, even on the National Mall. If a bunch of Catholic kids had tried to invade a sacred Native American rite being held outdoors on the mall, near the march or whatever, would the press have covered that? I would say the press would have covered that for sure. It would have received as much coverage as the alleged confrontation between a silent Catholic kid and an elderly adult Native American activist. That received enough coverage to, as we would say in Texas, sink a battleship. Why didn't the confrontation at one of the most important, arguably the most important Catholic church in the United States, the official church of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference, the official basilica, Vatican-recognized basilica of the United States, and a mass is being held inside and is taking part. Why didn't that protest get any coverage at all. Now, I raise that in the midst of our current decision to say I would consider that a 2019 test case of the Minneapolis situation, even though they didn't get inside. Many of the issues addressed in these laws would have been parallel to what happened in 2019 at the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception. And that case received, as far as I could, and I looked, zero mainstream press coverage. Zero. I'll state it one more time. What would have happened if the Covington High School students had, using, let's say, boom boxes playing Christian rock and roll songs or something, had tried to interrupt a service of Native Americans doing a sacred dance and chants and prayers somewhere in Washington, D.C., or even on the National Mall? I think it's safe to say the second one would have been covered like crazy. No, there was no coverage other than religious publications of the Basilica incident. So what we're showing here is a consistent pattern where media coverage of these issues is closely related to the political debates that are taking place about these laws. I don't think you can separate the two.
What did you make of the religious press coverage of it, the Baptist press in particular?
Well, the Baptist press, of course, was their own leaders saying these laws are very important, they need to be defended, and the Baptist leaders immediately say, we already have a national law on this. I mean, so to some degree, they're saying this is already clear, this is already in place. Now, I haven't studied any other denominational press or even, say, World Magazine or Christianity Today. I didn't see any coverage there yet. I predict as the bill debates go on, you will see this considered a conservative issue. And in the mainstream press, it will be viewed as a liberal issue in terms of defending the rights, the free speech rights of protesters and journalists. I think that will be the emphasis in the mainstream press, and that is a valid First Amendment issue. But the Baptist press story said, we need to also defend the First Amendment rights of worshipers. And you know what? Free practice of religion is in the First Amendment. So this is potentially a head-on clash between the two halves of the First Amendment, and we've had quite a few of those in recent years. And that's important. We need court rulings clarifying that. But how do we even have a discussion of this story when we have conservative publications that see the religious liberty aspect of this discussion, whereas we then have liberal publications that don't see that at all? They only see the First Amendment issues of free speech in the press. How do we have a public discussion when the journalism values are that different? It's a blind spot. The two halves of the First Amendment is this great blind spot. And frequently, as I've argued for several decades now, we have a lot of liberal Americans and journalists who respect the First Amendment rights of the press and free speech, but don't seem to have an equal respect for the First Amendment rights of religious people. And meanwhile, we have a lot of religious people who are not that fond or even respectful in terms of their views of the rights of the press. We have the First Amendment as two sides, and in between is a massive blind spot. And yes, it is affecting the coverage of these laws and the coverage of these debates. I hope editors in some important publications recognize this and assign religion beat reporters to go in, look at the 1994 law, look at its impact, look at the struggles people have had prosecuting under it, and actually treat this as a story that has two sides that are both worthy of respect and accurate coverage.
Returning to that AP story, what was this quote from an objector to these laws about these laws possibly being applied against church members that are singing out of turn.
Oh,
what was that doing there?
Yeah, that's really intriguing. I mean, what they're saying is, okay, so you're inside a church, and the minister is preaching on something controversial, and someone who's a member of the church stands up and starts singing a hymn that in some way contradicts the message of the minister. Do you arrest the church member? Now, good grief, I had not even thought of that. And that's a whole other layer here. This is not outsiders. Oh, by the way, go back to the Basilica. There's people on the security footage, I believe it is, and eyewitnesses who heard the activists who wanted to interrupt the service say, don't tell them who you are. Just enter the church and say you want to go to Mass. In other words, deceive them. And you're not lying. You do want to go to Mass, but you want to then chant and disrupt it. Okay, that's interesting. That's another wrinkle. These cases are, church-state issues are so complex. So what's the difference between someone who actually is a legal member of the church? Do they have a right to disrupt a worship service in their own congregation? Now, that's fascinating, and I'd love to know if that's ever happened, or under what circumstances has it happened. And, of course, you have some churches where their membership requirements are infinitely more strict than others. So you wouldn't be the same if it was an Orthodox Catholic church or something like that. Then it would be a non-denominational church where their membership rules, in some cases, may not even exist, or they may be not stringently defined or whatever. So, yeah, that's a funny sense. But once again, listeners need to hear me say that's a valid question. But what would happen? Okay, let's draw a parallel. What would happen if you had a member of the medical staff of an abortion clinic, and this man or woman changes their convictions about the procedures, and one day they're at work, they're inside the building, and they're a member of the staff? Would they be arrested if they started screaming at people and chanting things that interrupted the work and stopped what was going on there? That may be a little far-fetched of a parallel, but I'm willing to ask that question. Do they have a First Amendment right to interrupt work in their own workplace? Okay. That would be interesting to see what a court did with that.
Or would that be the occasion for a different law?
Well, a court would have to rule that, but at this point, the 1994 law is on the books. Now, you could say that the person in the abortion clinic has violated their contract. Now, there you go. That's a business law question. And you probably would not have the same level of limitation on their actions in free speech that you would have on a church member or a member of a mosque or a member of a synagogue. Yeah, so that's a good question. But that would involve the writing the terms of their contract. But what feels like the 100th time in this discussion, I'm going to have to say, we'd have to see what a court would say about that. If a Baptist pastor decided he changed his views on abortion and started preaching on it in a conservative pulpit from a liberal perspective, would he have the right to do that? Or could they call the police on him? You know, I don't know. You could see the different levels of legality here with workplace. But you're absolutely accurate to raise that as an issue. And all of that flows out of this idea, what if you are an actual member of the community defined by what is occurring inside that sanctuary or that health facility? Are your rights different than people who are protesters and activists coming in from the outside or trying to come in from the outside? I can't believe that many journalists in America would believe that right-wing, conservative, Catholic, evangelical, whatever, protesters at an abortion clinic could make the same claims that Don Lemon and those activists did in Minneapolis at that Baptist church. I don't think any journalist would believe that those are the same rights. But in the 1994 law, it appears they are.
Terry, while you are in Scotland, a big story here in the U.S. today was the firing of Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes. What's your take on this story?
Well, once again, he's under contract, so you have that. I think to some degree, the big question there is, what is the journalistic approach of the free press versus what is the journalistic approach of 60 Minutes? And I would say right now, the free press openly says that it tries to offer people who have strong opinions on different issues, let's say Israel. Barry Weiss obviously has very strong views on Israel, but she would say, those are my views. Everybody knows what they are. Everybody knows what I believe. But we're still going to run pieces of commentary journalism by people from different points of view on that issue. Now, the most recent thing that happened at 60 Minutes was when they were going to do a story on actions of the Trump administration, and they were going to air it without any response from the Trump administration or from the bureaucracy involved. Was it the State Department, if I remember correct? But it was, or was it immigration? But anyway, they were going to run the story without any response from the people they were reporting about. And Barry Weiss held the story up. She said it has not been adequately reported at this point. We can run it once we have allowed these other people to state their case. And the people in 60 Minutes, including Scott Pelley, is saying that was a violation of journalism ethics to hold up that story. Whereas Barry Weiss would say that was a violation of journalism ethics, that they weren't letting these people have their point of view reported. So that's the same kind of journalistic impasse over what journalism is, what does it mean to practice it, are you supposed to quote both sides, are you supposed to treat people on both sides of an issue accurately? I think our listeners can see that's very similar to what we've been discussing about whether journalists have an obligation to create a Baptist church in Minneapolis that's interrupted by protesters the same way they would treat an abortion facility in Minneapolis that was invaded and interrupted by, say, conservative opponents of abortion. What's news? What's journalism? What does it mean to be fair to the people on both sides in those stories? So even though there's, in so many ways, no parallels between the factual situation between 60 Minutes and what we're discussing with these important laws at the state level and the 1994 national law, I hope listeners can see there's a journalism parallel here. What has happened in which you can claim it was a violation of journalism ethics for the head of a newsroom to demand that reporters talk to people who were being covered in the story and get their point of view? That's an interesting and weird journalism situation, in my opinion. But then again, I'm very old, and maybe my journalism will be irrelevant.
Terry Mattingly, Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades, he led the GetReligion.org website, and he joined us from Scotland. Terry, thanks.
Glad to be here.
When we come back, Pastor Matt Harrison will be alongside. We'll talk about the comfort of Lutheran theology.
This is Molly Hemingway of The Federalist, inviting you to join me for the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case Conference, Friday, June 12th and Saturday, June 13th at Concordia University, Chicago. I'll be speaking and signing copies of my new book, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the U.S. Constitution. Learn more at issuesetc.org. issuesetc.org.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
We're supported by listeners like you. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Lutherans for Life assists for-life Christians in offering the hope and help of the good news of Jesus Christ to women with an untimely pregnancy, women, men, and families suffering under the guilt of an abortion, young people with questions and concerns about sexuality, and the elderly and those with disabilities or terminal illnesses. Learn more about LFL resources and forming a life team or life chapter, or becoming a life advocate by calling 888-364-LIFE. That is 888-364-5433, or by visiting lutheransforlife.org.